If you're drawn to the shadows of the past and the untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe and join us on this dark journey. Tonight we descend into a world that is strangely well recorded and yet deeply misunderstood. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly feel the pull of these stories. And tell me where you're watching from and what hour the night has reached for you, because there is something unsettling about knowing how many souls are listening in the dark. Now dim the lights, let the room grow quiet. Perhaps let a faint hum fill the silence, and slowly we begin. You wake, or rather, you drift back into consciousness, in a space so small, your body already knows its limits. Turn too quickly and your elbow meets stone. Welcome to your cellar. This is home and workplace and prison all at once. A narrow chamber buried beneath the noise of Rome, or stacked above a tavern where laughter never quite sounds sincere. A room without windows, without air, without mercy. A place designed not for living, but for enduring. Your bed is a sack of straw, damp with sweat, alive with fleas, carrying the faint scent of wine, smoke, and something heavier, something like resignation. If fortune has smiled on you, there is a small oil lamp nearby, flickering weakly against the dark. If fortune has not, then even the light has been taken. Your belongings sit in the corner, a comb, a smear of cheap powder, perhaps a bronze mirror, if the past week has been kind, though even it seems tired of reflecting this life. There is no water, no bath, no comfort, only a bucket, and the quiet agreement not to think too much about it. Bathing will come later, in crowded halls where strangers share water, and silence, and the unbearable awareness of one another. But there is no time to linger, because this room is not just where you sleep. It is where they come. The door does not protect you, it announces you. A knock, a voice, sometimes no warning at all. Here, privacy is a fantasy Rome never bothered to invent. Walls are thin, doors are suggestions, and dignity is something you learn to ration. So the ritual begins. You sweep the dust, the stains, the forgotten sandals of men who will never remember you. You erase the evidence, not for cleanliness, but for survival. Then comes the mask. Powder across your face, color forced into your cheeks, perfume layered thick enough to drown the truth beneath it. Not to smell good, just less bad than the next man waiting. You practice a smile in the mirror, a half smile, something soft, something inviting, something believable, even if you no longer believe it yourself. Someone once called you charmingly awake. You remember that more than you should, because here, in the dim breath of the cellar, even the smallest kindness lingers like a ghost. Every morning begins the same. Tight walls, rushed hands, and just enough strength to reach midday. Hygiene comes next, or something pretending to be it. There is no private space for it. Not here, not for you. Rome builds marble temples to beauty, while its streets carry the quiet filth of survival. So you choose your compromise. A fountain, quick and cold, splashing away the night without asking questions. Or, if the coins in your purse allow it, the baths, the great equalizer, where bodies press together in steam, merchants beside soldiers, philosophers beside fools, all dissolving into the same humid anonymity. You step into the water, and for a moment, you are simply another person, No titles, no judgment, just warmth and breath. A strigil scrapes across your skin, peeling away dirt, and something deeper, something harder to name. For a fleeting instant, you are clean, and then, just as quickly, it fades. Perfume returns, heavier now, almost desperate. There is still no cure for sweat, no invention to hold back the human body, only layers and hope. You finish the illusion, pale powder to mask exhaustion, red to mimic life, dark lines around the eyes to hide how little sleep you've known. They do not want truth, they want a story, and you must become it. Then comes the uniform, not chosen, but assigned by the silent laws of society. The toga, once a symbol of dignity, now a declaration. Not a citizen, not a wife, not respectable. Available, visible, defined, behind, where other women wear the stola. Layered, controlled, respectable. You wear brightness, boldness, something impossible to ignore. Jewelry that shines too loudly, fabric that moves too freely, a presence designed to be seen before it is understood. Because invisibility is not an option, not here, not in a city this hungry. Your hair is shaped, altered, sometimes replaced entirely. Blonde from distant lands, foreign, desirable, unnatural, and therefore valuable. Every detail matters, every detail sells, and when it is done, you stand there, transformed, not hidden, but exposed in exactly the right way. In a city of 1,000,000 lives, this is your name, your signal, your survival. And so, the day begins, and the tax, it always came, silent at first, then inevitable. Its weight shifting depending on where you stood, who you served, whether your clients wore polished rings or blood-stained armor. But no matter the details, it always found you. It always took its share. You paid by the act or by the week, coin by coin, breath by breath. There were no deductions, not for the silence that followed a stranger's touch, not for the hollow ache behind your eyes, not for the quiet unraveling of something inside you. Refuse to pay, and the consequences sharpened quickly. Fines, arrest, disappearance from the lists that allowed you to exist at all. Though Rome was inconsistent, sometimes blind, sometimes easily persuaded by a smile or a whispered bargain, still the message was clear. Rome disapproved, deeply, and yet it collected. A city built on contradiction, condemning you by day, profiting from you by night. At least you could take comfort in one bitter truth. Somewhere, another temple rose from the dust, funded in part by your survival. A temple to gods who would never answer you. In Rome, you were legal, registered, documented, acknowledged, and still endlessly judged. Every senator, every priest, every wandering philosopher carried an opinion. Most of them formed after leaving your room. There was no official force, no uniforms, no badges, just eyes, everywhere, a quiet network of moral watchers, watching, whispering, condemning. At the top, the Senate, old men wrapped in dignity, speaking of virtue, as if it was something they had preserved. They spoke of decay, of decline, of the dangers of indulgence, then vanished into the very places they condemned. Tabs unpaid, secrets carefully buried, Then came the aediles, Rome's enforcers of order, inspectors of cleanliness, of decency, of appearances. They checked your rooms, your presence, your visibility. Too obvious, and you were fined. Not obvious enough, and you were punished. A paradox with no solution. You could not win, only comply. Writers, poets, thinkers, men like Juvenal and Seneca turned your life into ink, mocking, exaggerating, condemning, and yet describing it all in such vivid detail that it felt less like observation and more like memory. Even the matrons, Rome's respectable women, joined the chorus. They passed you in the streets, eyes sharp as blades, judgment without words. Some demanded laws to erase you, to strip away what little presence you had left, while their husbands quietly ensured your survival. Then came the body, the cost no one wrote laws about. Disease, creeping, invisible, inevitable. Rome did not understand it, not truly, but it recognized the aftermath. Symptoms whispered in back rooms, conditions no one dared name aloud. Treatments were desperate, vinegar, herbs, prayers offered to silent gods. Sometimes the body healed, sometimes it did not. Pregnancy lingered as another shadow, constant, unavoidable. There were methods, crude, uncertain, plants harvested to extinction, remedies balanced between hope and illusion. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they failed, and when they failed, choices narrowed into darkness. Children raised among the same walls or left behind, where Rome chose not to see. For daily pain, there were simpler solutions. Wine, thick and numbing, opium, drifting the mind away from itself, or the harsh voice of a Leno, reminding you to endure. Temples offered another kind of remedy. You could lie on cold stone, waiting for a dream, a message, a cure, anything. Infections spread easily. Hands were not clean. Nothing was clean. And beneath it all, something quieter grew. Exhaustion, anxiety, a heaviness that had no name. There were no healers for that. Only shared glances, cheap wine, and the rare comfort of something that listened without asking. Even the gods were watching, always watching. In a city where divine will explained everything, you learned to negotiate with the unseen. Some gods were kinder, or at least less cruel. Venus lingered closest, goddess of beauty, desire, and consequences. Goddess of beauty, desire, and consequences. Small offerings filled your room, flowers, perfume, coins placed carefully in hope, not for love, just for easier nights. Then there was Fortuna, unpredictable, shifting, essential. Your earnings rose and fell with her mood. A bracelet one night, nothing the next. You whispered to her, often, especially before opening the door to someone who smiled too easily. But faith had a darker side. Superstition, whispers, unseen threats. You burned incense, tied cords, warded off eyes that might linger too long. Sometimes you fought back, curses carved into tablets, hidden, buried. Wishes for rivals to fall, to fade, to disappear. Rome remembered these, scratched into stone, petty, desperate, human. If you were enslaved, you turned to Mercury, god of trade, of exchange, of lives measured in transactions. And if freedom ever seemed possible, then Libertas waited, distant, almost unreal. A dream with a name, love, if it came at all, came quietly, uncertain, fragile, often false. Clients spoke of it easily. After wine, after words, after illusions, they called it real. You called it part of the act. Sometimes you almost believed them. Sometimes they almost believed themselves. But Rome had rules, even for hope. You were marked, labeled, infamous, unfit for marriage, unfit for belonging. And yet, stories persisted, promises whispered in the dark, escape, freedom, a life beyond this one, most dissolved by mourning. A few lingered. Among yourselves, something truer formed, shared hardship, shared laughter, shared silence, friendships, bonds, sometimes more than that, hidden where Rome refused to look. And always there were dreams, small ones, fragile ones, a shop by the sea, a life that did not smell of smoke and strangers, maybe not real, but necessary, because without them, there was only the work and the waiting. Women who often served as herbalists within the household used angelica to treat gynecological conditions. It was believed to regulate menstrual cycles, to steady what was seen as the body's internal rhythm, and to ease childbirth, one of the most dangerous and sacred moments in Norse society. A moment suspended between life and death, between continuation and loss, where even silence in the longhouse felt heavier than iron. Because of its reputation as a purifier, angelica was also burned in smoke rituals, its rising vapors drifting through wooden halls and narrow doorways, cleansing homes during illness and warding off disease when sickness seemed to linger in the air itself. In every Viking community, from isolated farms carved into cold valleys to coastal trading towns beaten by wind and salt, angelica was more than medicine. It was a presence, a constant ally in survival. Its scent, sharp and green, clung to the memory of healing. As if the plant itself refused to be forgotten, it stood as a quiet promise that even in a harsh and unpredictable world, recovery was still possible. As spring finally returned to the Viking world, breaking the long silence of winter, another remedy emerged from the thawing land. Birch sap. The birch tree was everywhere across Scandinavia, pale trunks rising like bones from frozen soil, branches trembling in cold wind. It was not just wood, it was life itself, moving. In early spring, healers and families tapped its bark carefully, watching as clear sap began to flow, a slow, patient rising from deep within the earth. It had a faint sweetness, almost fragile, as if the forest was briefly offering something gentle before returning to its harshness. But this was not random gathering. It required timing, precision, respect, because the sap existed only for a short window before the tree fully awakened and sealed its flow once more. Those who collected it knew this was a brief permission granted by nature, nothing more. Healers gave birch sap to those weakened by winter, bodies drained by cold, hunger, or lingering fever that refused to leave. It was consumed fresh or left to ferment into a mild drink that carried warmth without fire. In the mouth it felt clean, almost weightless, as if it carried the memory of snow melting into spring soil, rich in minerals and natural sugars. It restored what the long winter had stripped away, slowly rebuilding strength where exhaustion had settled like dust. In a time without measurement or science as it is known today, this was understood through observation alone. A body improved, or it did not, and birch sap often meant that it did. When fever came, as it so often did in this world, without protection or certainty, healers did not rely on a single cure. They layered remedies like shields. Birch sap was paired with cooling herbs, meadowsweet, elderflower, plants gathered from damp fields and quiet riverbanks. Together they softened heat in the body, bringing down what was understood as imbalance. In more severe cases, bitter herbs such as wormwood were added. Harsh, unforgiving, it was believed they could force the body to purge what poisoned it from within, as if suffering itself could be expelled like smoke from a burning house. The logic was simple: cleanse, restore, rebalance, a rhythm of correction in a world that rarely stayed stable for long. Birch was not only consumed, it was transformed. The bark, when boiled, released a dark resin-like substance, thick and sharp-smelling, used to treat infections of the skin, burns, cuts, wounds that refused to close quietly. It was applied directly, pressed into injury, as if sealing the body back together through force of will. Leaves were used in poultices and steam baths, where heat and moisture carried their properties deeper into the body. People sat wrapped in rising vapor, breathing in the scent of sap and wood, believing that what entered through the lungs could reach what words could not. Prayer often accompanied this process, not as decoration but as structure, a way to align physical suffering with something larger than flesh. Symbolically, the birch tree represented renewal, purity, return. It was the first to grow after fire or clearing, the first to reclaim damaged land, white trunks rising like quiet witnesses to destruction and renewal. In Norse and Germanic tradition, this made it sacred. Not gentle sacredness, but survival sacredness. The kind born from endurance. Using its sap in healing was not just practical, it was symbolic alignment with renewal itself, borrowing the tree's ability to begin again. Each drop carried that idea forward, as if recovery was not only possible, but expected. In the healer's practice, birch sap was seasonal treasure, a brief gift, a reminder that even in cold landscapes where survival was never guaranteed, life still returned, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, through bark, through blood, through breath. Juniper followed this same logic of survival through intensity. In Viking herbal medicine, juniper was not gentle, it was sharp, immediate, uncompromising. It grew in rocky soil where little else could survive, twisted branches clinging to stone and wind. Its presence alone felt defensive, as if the plant itself was resisting the landscape around it. Healers used it to cleanse the body, the air, and even the space between people. Juniper berries acted as a diuretic, pushing the body to release excess fluids and perceived toxins. In conditions marked by swelling or lingering fever, this purging was seen as necessary correction, not comfort, but removal. Its smoke was perhaps even more important. Dried branches were burned indoors, filling enclosed spaces with dense, resinous air. This was not fragrance for pleasure, it was intervention. The smoke moved through walls and cloth, reaching into every corner where sickness might hide. It was believed to drive out disease itself, as if illness could be forced into retreat by pressure of scent alone. Modern understanding recognizes antimicrobial effects, but for the Vikings, this was already known in a different language, the language of survival. Homes were fumigated, ships were cleansed, rooms were filled with smoke after death or illness, not as ritual alone, but as necessity wrapped in belief. Juniper also lived in the spiritual imagination. Branches were placed above doorways, not for decoration, but for protection. Travelers carried it in bundles, small fragments of forest defense against unknown roads ahead. Its scent was grounding, heavy, earthbound, as if reminding those who inhaled it that the world was dangerous, but not unmanageable. To the healer, juniper was a boundary plant between sickness and health, between chaos and control, between what could be seen and what could not. It did not whisper comfort, it enforced survival. Joan urged an aggressive strategy, insisting the voices had already spoken the outcome into existence, not as theory, not as hope, but as something inevitable, already decided somewhere beyond the smoke of the battlefield. Despite her youth, she did not stay behind the lines. She rode with the soldiers, close enough to the edge of death that every breath felt borrowed. Her presence was not distant command, but proximity. Dust, steel, noise, fear. Where others hesitated, she advanced. Where others looked for safety, she placed herself in the most exposed ground of all. The soldiers watched her not as a commander, but as something heavier, something charged with meaning that words could not contain. Over the course of a week, the French launched a series of offensives meant to fracture the siege around Orléans. Each movement carried exhaustion. Each advance carried risk. Each hour felt stretched beyond reason. Joan did not only carry a sword, she carried her banner high above the chaos, visible even through smoke and shouting, a white symbol cutting through the dark weight of war. She called out not with strategy, but with belief. Faith sharpened into sound, purpose turned into voice. During the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, she was struck. An arrow buried itself in her shoulder. For a moment, the body faltered, the world narrowed, pain became absolute. But she refused retreat, refused the language of withdrawal, refused the logic of survival over meaning. Her wound was dressed quickly, roughly, amid chaos that did not pause for healing. And then she returned, back into the fire of the field, back into the collapsing rhythm of battle. The English lines did not expect this return. Men who believed they had wounded certainty itself now saw it walking again. On May 8th, the siege broke. The English forces withdrew, not slowly, not cleanly, but as something that had lost its grip on reality. Orléans had not simply been defended, it had been reclaimed, a decisive rupture in a war that had long felt endless. For France, it was not only victory, it was the return of possibility, and at the center of it stood Joan, not as myth yet, not as legend, but as something witnessed, something undeniable. The first part of her declared mission had been fulfilled, and now she turned toward the second. Reims, the coronation city, the place where kings were made sacred through ritual and tradition older than memory itself. Charles the Dauphin would not remain a claimant, he would be made king. But Reims was not free land. It lay deep within hostile control, guarded by Burgundian allegiance and English presence. To reach it meant crossing territory that did not want them to exist. Still, Joan insisted, not as suggestion, not as debate, but as inevitability spoken aloud. The path, she claimed, had already been opened by something higher than war. After a series of victories along the Loire Valley, momentum shifted. Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency. One after another, towns broke, fell, or surrendered under pressure that felt larger than military force alone. By July 1429, the march toward Reims began. This was not a campaign anymore. It was a procession wrapped inside danger. Villages opened their gates. Castles yielded without resistance. Rumors moved faster than armies that she carried divine approval. That resistance meant defiance of fate itself. Fear changed shape in her presence. On July 16th, Reims was reached. The city did not resist. It accepted surrender with quiet inevitability, as if already aware of what was coming. Inside the Cathedral of Reims, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. Stone, silence, ritual older than memory. And beside him stood Joan, holding her banner upright, as if anchoring something fragile into place. For her, this was fulfillment, not symbolic, not abstract, realized prophecy. The completion of what had been spoken into her visions. France now had a crowned king again, and Joan had become part of that transformation. But triumph does not remain still for long. At court, the atmosphere began to shift. The urgency that once defined her presence started to fade into political hesitation. Charles, now king, began to look at survival differently, at diplomacy, at balance, at caution. Joan had completed what she was called for, but she did not step back. Her focus turned further still, toward Paris. The heart of the kingdom still under enemy control, but the court no longer moved with her certainty. Support became thinner, hesitation grew heavier. Still, she pushed forward. After operations in the Loire Valley, the path toward Paris was prepared through smaller campaigns and shifting alliances. But the energy was no longer unified. Paris stood fortified. Strong walls, English and Burgundian defense, experience hardened into structure. On September 8th, the assault began at the Porte Saint-Honoré. Joan moved at the front once again. Banner first, body exposed, voice rising above the noise. The fighting was brutal, close, unforgiving. Arrows filled the air like constant judgment. Stones fell without pattern. Then impact. A crossbow bolt struck her thigh. Pain anchored her in place for a moment, but she did not leave. She continued directing, calling, refusing silence. But momentum did not shift. Night approached. Exhaustion accumulated. Losses grew. The order to retreat came, not from her, but from command structure above her resistance. She opposed it, but it held. The assault collapsed into withdrawal. Paris remained untouched, and something within her influence began to weaken. At court, belief fractured. Her certainty no longer aligned with political caution. Charles no longer depended on her presence as before. The war was becoming governance, and governance required compromise. Joan continued smaller campaigns, Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier, La Charité, local victories, isolated successes, often funded through external support rather than royal backing. But the alignment had shifted. Her vision of total liberation no longer matched the direction of power around her. Still, she did not stop, even wounded, even increasingly isolated, even as support thinned into distance, until Compiègne. In the spring of 1430, she moved to defend the town against Burgundian forces. On May 23rd, she led a sortie outside the walls. The battle turned. French forces began to fall back. Joan remained behind, covering retreat, refusing abandonment. But chaos closed around her. The gates shut, too early, too final. She was left outside, exposed, surrounded, captured, pulled from her horse, taken alive. The fall was immediate and absolute. Not death, but removal. Months passed in Burgundian custody. She became a political object, not prisoner alone, but leverage. Eventually, she was sold to the English, transported to Rouen, English-controlled Normandy, administrative center of occupation. There, in January 1431, her trial began. Not as prisoner of war, but as heretic. A legal transformation designed to erase legitimacy through doctrine. The process was overseen by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, aligned with English interests. The goal was not truth, it was dismantling. She was held in a secular prison, guarded by soldiers, denied protections normally granted by church law. Interrogation followed interrogation, hours stretched into exhaustion, pressure without relief. Yet she answered, a teenager, uneducated by formal standards, standing against trained clerics and structured accusation. They questioned visions, clothing, authority, identity, especially her claim to divine voices and her wearing of male clothing. She did not bend. Her answers remained consistent, her conviction intact. When asked about grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." Neither surrender nor arrogance, only placement beyond certainty. But the outcome had already been decided elsewhere. Political necessity outweighed defense. She was condemned for heresy. Execution followed. On May 30th, 1431, she was taken to the marketplace in Rouen, bound to a stake, fire prepared, crowd gathered. She was 19. As flames rose, she called upon the name of Jesus. Repeatedly, a small cross was held before her by a soldier, a final gesture of humanity inside collapse. Witnesses described calmness, not chaos, not resistance, but presence. Her death was meant to erase her. Instead, it expanded her. Even among English observers, doubt emerged. One cleric reportedly said they had burned a saint. Over time, her memory strengthened rather than faded. In 1456, her trial was declared invalid, her name cleared. Centuries passed, her image grew into symbol, into national identity, into myth and memory intertwined. In 1920, she was canonized, Saint Joan of Arc. Execution transformed into recognition, condemnation transformed into reverence. But her story is not the only one preserved in fragments of survival. The life of a medieval baker began long before daylight, before towns stirred, before markets opened, before voices returned to streets. Bakers worked in darkness, surrounded by heat and repetition. Dough prepared through instinct, fermentation guided by experience rather than measurement. Flour varied by region, grain quality shaped outcome, water drawn from wells, everything mixed by hand. The kneading was physical, continuous, demanding strength and repetition until texture changed under pressure. Ovens required preparation long before baking. Wood burned until walls held stored heat. Ash cleared carefully. Bread placed inside with long wooden peels. By morning, bread emerged, warm, essential, ordinary and necessary all at once. For many, it was survival itself. Work did not end with baking. It extended into delivery, accounting, preparation for the next cycle. Tools shaped this rhythm. Stone or brick ovens held heat. Wooden troughs held dough. Peels moved bread through fire. Scoops measured flour. Sacks stored grain. Buckets carried water. Each object part of repetition that defined daily survival. And beyond tools, hands themselves carried mastery. Reading dough without language, knowing heat without measurement, recognizing completion through instinct alone. Every loaf was transformation, from grain to sustenance, from labor to life. In the medieval world, bread was more than food. It was the quiet architecture of survival. Every loaf carried weight beyond its crust, a reflection of who you were allowed to be in the eyes of society. The wealthiest citizens, nobles, clergy, prosperous merchants, reached for mancha, white bread so finely sifted it seemed almost removed from earth itself. Soft, pale, expensive, it seemed almost removed from earth itself. Soft, pale, expensive, its purity was not natural. It was engineered through labor hidden behind flour dust and endless sieving. Each loaf represented time, effort, and privilege layered into something as simple as a slice. Meanwhile, in the middle layers of medieval life, townsfolk and tradesmen lived on wheaten or maslin bread. Still wheat, but heavier, darker, honest in its texture. It was the bread of markets and workshop doors, of hands that never stopped moving. It fed the rhythm of towns that never truly slept, only shifted between exhaustion and necessity. And below them, at the edge of survival itself, came the black breads. Rye, barley, oats, whatever the land would still give. Dense loaves that sat in the stomach like memory, filling, yes, but never gentle, sometimes stretched further with peas, beans, chestnut flour, anything that could delay hunger for one more day. Each bite was not just nourishment, but a reminder of position, of limits, of quiet endurance. In monasteries, bread took on another life entirely, divided between humility and hierarchy. Some loaves were simple, austere, eaten in silence under vows of poverty. Others were refined, soft white breads reserved for guests and higher clergy, a contradiction baked into devotion itself. Even feasts turned bread into language. Trenchers, thick stale slices, served as plates for the wealthy, only to be passed down afterward, consumed by servants or given to the poor. Even charity had texture. Even generosity had layers. At monastery gates, at noble kitchens, bread became mercy made visible. A loaf handed out could quiet hunger or define the boundary between those who gave and those who received. In every town, a baker did not simply produce food, they produced structure. Multiple breads, multiple classes, multiple realities, all rising in the same oven. Bread was economy, bread was order, bread was identity baked into form, and behind every loaf there was law. Guilds watched over bakers with silent authority. Weight, size, ingredients, pricing, nothing was left unmeasured. Nothing was allowed to drift into uncertainty. To apprentice meant years of repetition, shaping dough under watchful eyes that remembered every mistake. To become a master meant permission and responsibility that never truly ended. Because bread was not private work, it was public trust. Inspectors could arrive without warning, weighing loaves, testing fairness, exposing deviation in front of the entire town. The assize of bread and ale in England turned flour into legislation, tying the price of bread to grain itself, forcing bakers to carry the instability of harvests in their hands. When grain rose, loaves shrank. When grain fell, expectations rose. The baker absorbed the pressure between them, and if they failed, the punishment was not hidden. Stocks, public humiliation, rotten food thrown by hungry hands. Sometimes a loaf hung around the neck, like accusation made physical, because bread was not allowed to fail. Not in a world where failure meant hunger spreading faster than rumor. And yet, behind regulation, behind inspection, behind punishment, there was fire, always fire. The bakehouse was a place where survival and destruction lived side by side. ovens burning hot enough to shape stone itself, roaring heat trapped in clay domes that could hold destruction as easily as nourishment. One mistake, and flame did not remain contained. It spread through timber, through thatch, through streets built too close to forget how fragile they were. Entire towns understood this risk without needing words, because every loaf carried the memory of what fire could take back. Even the bakers themselves bore it in their bodies, smoke in lungs, heat in skin. Scars formed quietly over years of repetition. Hands burned, arms marked, breath shortened by invisible residue of constant proximity to flame. Still, the work continued, because stopping meant hunger. In some places, communal ovens replaced private ones, shared spaces where families brought dough already prepared. Less fire in homes, but more dependence on a single point of heat, a single point of risk. If the oven failed, the entire community felt it. Bread was never isolated. It was collective vulnerability made edible. And yet, the bakehouse did not belong only to men. Women moved through its heat with equal presence, often without recognition. In villages, they baked for families, for neighbors, for survival, that never paused for record or record-keeping. In towns, widows inherited ovens. Guild rules bent quietly when necessity demanded continuity. Hands that shaped dough were not defined by name, but by repetition, by mornings that began before light, by nights that never fully ended. Even selling bread became its own form of movement. Baskets carried through streets, transactions made face to face, survival exchanged in loaves passed from hand to hand. And while recognition was uneven, the result was not. Bread still reached the mouths it was meant to feed. Because in medieval life, interruption was not an option. Even the church folded bread into something larger than food, into ritual, into presence, into belief made physical. The Eucharist transformed bread into body, into meaning that transcended grain entirely. Only pure white flour, only silence, only precision. In those moments, baking was no longer labor. It was ceremony. Monasteries became centers of production and distribution, feeding monks, travelers, and the poor at their gates. Bread moved through sacred and ordinary worlds without distinction. Even charity took shape in loaves offered for the dead, or distributed on feast days, or left at altars where memory and hunger met. Bread was never just consumption, it was communication between worlds. And rulers understood this better than anyone, because controlling bread meant controlling stability itself, prices adjusted by law, supplies monitored by authority. Bakers watched as closely as any soldier or tax collector. A town fed was a town quiet, a town hungry, something else entirely. Bread riots were not rare, they were anticipated, because hunger did not negotiate. It assembled, it moved, it broke doors open when patience ended, and so rulers used bread as both shield and signal. Distribute it and gain loyalty, control it and maintain order. In every direction, bread became political weight disguised as daily routine. And still, through all of this structure, all of this pressure, all of this fire, the baker continued. Before dawn, after exhaustion, between laws and hunger and expectation, dough was still needed, ovens still lit, loaves still shaped into something that could be carried into the world. Because every town depended on this invisible cycle, this repetition of heat and grain and human endurance. And when morning finally came, when streets slowly filled and doors opened and voices returned, the bread was already there, warm, ordinary, essential, as if it had always existed, waiting to be claimed. But what no one ever fully accounted for was how something so routine could hold so much control over life itself, until the morning came when the ovens stayed cold and the town began to realize that bread was never just made, it was allowed, and something had quietly stopped allowing it. History is full of secrets waiting in the dark. If you crave more of these forgotten tales, subscribe and walk this path with us. Until the next shadow falls.